All right, I think that we are live.
All right.
But I have to turn it off here, so give me just a second. All right, we are live. So welcome. I'm Lori Stone. I am External Relations Director for NCIP. This is our summer shelter series. So we did, if you were all joining us on Facebook before, we did a spring shelter series, which consisted of 4 episodes. We're now entering summer, and we're doing a series of 3, and we're focusing on our policy reform efforts. And so this first one is about our past and Reform Retrospective. And the reason that we're doing and having these discussions is to inform our audience and viewers about NCIP's reform efforts and how they coincide with social justice issues and spotlighting cases as well. That's why we're doing it. If you have questions, if you have comments along the way, it's definitely just put it in the comments in Facebook, and I'll be monitoring that and asking the guests here to respond as we go along. We have 3 very, very special guests. Linda Starr, NCIP's Executive Director and Co-Founder. Missy O'Connell is NCIP's Attorney and Policy Liaison. And Lionel Rubalcava, who is an NCIP client, and he was exonerated May 15th, 2019, after 17 years of wrongful incarceration. So we will be hearing from all 3 of them. We'll kick off this Reform Retrospective with a historical perspective from Linda, our Executive Director, starting from 2001 of NCIP, but even before then, about Innocence work. And so, Linda, I would love for you to kick it off for us with that perspective.
Sure. Thank you, Lori. This is an exciting series. Thank you for organizing this. NCIP began in 2001, but of course that was not the start of when Innocence work began. Innocence work actually began from the start of the criminal justice system, but really became a focus of work by Thurgood Marshall when he was working for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And he started using cases, arguing innocence in cases to exonerate people who'd been wrongfully convicted in racially charged cases. Then, as time went on, other organizations began focusing on innocence work as well. There was an organization called Centurion Ministries that was a faith-based organization. It continues to exist today, that did some amazing work doing exoneration cases. And then with the advent of DNA, we had a new avenue with which to demonstrate innocence and with which to show the problems in the criminal justice system. And so the Innocence Project in New York, headed by Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld, began looking at cases where there was DNA, testing the DNA, and using that DNA to demonstrate that somebody had been wrongfully convicted. In so doing, we were able to take apart cases, and the Innocence Project in New York was not able to handle every case in the country, and many of us all around the country decided we also need to have an Innocence Project to address those wrongful convictions in our state. And so in California, we now have the Northern California Innocence Project, that's us. The California Innocence Project at Cal Western in Southern California. The Loyola Project for the Innocent in Los Angeles. Those are the 3 members of the California Innocence Coalition. The work has continued. We started in 2001, and we didn't really start with cases. In fact, we started with policy work. What happened was, in order to get DNA testing, there needed to be a mechanism that existed in the state to allow that post-conviction DNA testing. So Cookie Rodolphe, who's a tenured professor here at Santa Clara, and I and others became involved in a legislative effort to get a statute passed in California that would permit post-conviction DNA testing. And we got it passed. Senator Burton sponsored it. It was passed, and when it was passed, we realized we now needed to exist in order to try and advance some of these motions where people would seek post-conviction DNA testing. So that's how we started, was with policy work, and that launched us.
Can you give us an example of a case, an early case? Albert Johnson comes to mind. Can you talk about that?
Yes. So in fact, Albert Johnson was the first DNA exoneration under the statute in the state of California. There had been one without the statute where the DA had agreed to do the testing, but under the statute, Mr. Johnson, who was incarcerated for a rape that he didn't commit, wrote his own motion under the new statute, and then contacted us, and we continued pursuing the testing, and the testing demonstrated that it wasn't Albert, and he was exonerated of that rape. Interestingly enough, at the same time, he was charged with having committed a crime while in prison. He insisted that he hadn't done that either. We investigated that and found out that he was telling the truth. He had not committed that either, and that in fact, the corrections officers had admitted that they had talked to other people who were in the prison and said that somebody else had planted the contraband in his cell because they didn't want a Black person in that cell block. And so we were able to demonstrate that to the court and to the Attorney General's office, who ultimately conceded that. And so Albert was twice exonerated out of the same case. And neither of those would have happened had we not had that statute to allow us to challenge his conviction. Mm-hmm. So that was our first DNA exoneration.
And so what was the year? Like, this was back right in the beginning, right?
Yes. So 2001 is when we started. And we started, like I said, to immediately be in place for when the new statute took effect. Albert's case had to be 2002 or 3, perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is, I just want to make a point of us going as an organization looking into our past reform efforts, but also the past cases, like all of our cases that have issues that come up throughout that we're able to see that sort of coincide with what's going on in our communities today. And so this is a case where it was clear that you could see racial injustice happening in this case, in this particular man's case while he was in prison, this prison violation. So that's I just want to make a note as we go through that when we're looking at the past, there's always those intersections that when we're looking at very specific stories and very specific people is when you see these injustices happening, and so we can pinpoint those along the way.
And the other thing that Albert's case demonstrated was mistaken eyewitness identification. I mean, it was DNA that ended up exonerating him because it was not him that had committed the rape, and it was overt racism that caused the wrongful conviction in the prison violation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so moving ahead in the work of NCIP, so that was the 1405, that was early on, that was DNA. When you moved through cases and you started getting more cases through the years, thinking about several more examples that come up later on, sort of that middle period from where we're at now, 2007-ish to 2011, there are several cases there. Can you talk about those? Because that doesn't necessarily deal with DNA. It kind of moved the organization away from only looking at that DNA right there as it started. There was a commitment to not just take DNA cases. And so now you're seeing a number of other issues come up. Can you talk about Obi, Maurice, Frankie, George, those cases and what that entails?
So there was a period there where we started looking at cases in the mid 2000s that these cases take an enormously long time to investigate and pursue, and particularly when we in our early days, before people were willing to recognize that wrongful convictions actually happened. So we spent a long time investigating each of these cases, and each of them demonstrated problems with mistaken eyewitness identification, like in Maurice's case, and eyewitness identification procedures, best ones to use when trying to obtain an eyewitness identification. In Obi's case, you not only had eyewitness identification, you had a snitch who got a great benefit for testifying against Obi, implicating him and testifying him. So we saw firsthand just how dangerous and sinister snitch testimony can be. In Frankie's case, you had the gang wars that were happening in Los Angeles that allowed sheriffs to adopt the attitude, or I didn't allow them, but they did adopt the attitude that if you lived in a certain neighborhood, you were gang associated. And so therefore, it didn't really matter if you convicted this offense, you did something. And so they were reckless in how they obtained identifications and got people implicated for participating in something. And then in George Soliotis's case, you had a case with bad, faulty forensic science. It was an arson case where they used bad science to indicate that they thought they had proven that the case was an arson, when in fact it was nothing but a tragic accident. So we had a collection of cases in a fairly short amount of time that demonstrated a number of problems that lead to wrongful convictions. But what I do want to say is that from the time we started, the co-founder, Cookie Rodolphe, was always interested in reform work. It was always something that she thought that this project should do. So we never only did cases or only did reform work. We always, and she in particular, always saw it as inseparable, that you had to do both at the same time, because while it was so important to obtain the exonerations, it was also important to change the system to prevent them and to address the consequences of them. So, so we never stopped doing reform work.
Mm-hmm. And so when with, you know, you have a number of cases going on, you've learned a lot, you're moving forward. There was some research that was done too. So can you highlight those research things?
Of course. So the first thing that happened was not long after we came into existence and had a few successes right out the gate demonstrating some wrongful convictions in the state of California, the California Senate appointed a commission called the California Commission on the Fair Administration of Justice. And Cookie was appointed as one of the commissioners. They met once a month. They investigated all the causes that could contribute to a wrongful conviction. They took testimony. They had questioning done by a very diverse panel, including all the stakeholders in the criminal justice system, from law enforcement to judges to criminal defense attorneys to those who were affected, and came up with a lot of recommendations, many of which we still look to today as key recommendations for how to better adjust the system. But in the course of doing that, Cookie, one of the things Cookie was very involved in was looking at prosecutorial misconduct as one of the causes and contributing factors to wrongful conviction. So she conducted a study. It was called Preventable Error. It was a report on prosecutorial misconduct in California from 1997 to 2009, and examined cases where courts had found prosecutorial misconduct, not where she did, but where courts did, and identified who the perpetrators were, found where in the state this was happening, and found those that committed more than one, so the repeat offenders. It was a groundbreaking study. It required, and it was Cookie Rodolphe and Maurice Posley that did it together. It was published. Other states looked to it as a way to model the same inquiry in their states. It has been cited in numerous courts and other articles, including the United States Supreme Court. It really did shine a light on the fact that prosecutorial misconduct is found and rarely addressed in any way. And I think it really shifted how courts considered prosecutorial misconduct in their decision making. Stemming from that was also a study that was done by Cookie Rodolphe and Todd Freeze, the associate director here at the Northern California Innocence Project, called Material Indifference. Here you go. And that was, it was really more of a follow-up. It addressed Brady specifically and the prosecutor's obligation to turn over certain sorts of information and how courts were handling the materiality requirement in that context. And that again was launched, it launched inquiries all over other states as well to try to figure out how courts handled Brady material.
Okay, so let's move through our timeline. Let's go up to 2014 when NCIP did a strategic plan, embarked on planning for the organization, looking ahead. Talk about that, because that sort of is what got us to where we are today. It set us up.
So that was a really important effort. And what we did in identifying our strategic plan goals was realize we needed a more focused effort on our policy. We needed to have a point person who would steer us as an organization through legislative actions, because while we were doing this phenomenal data-driven research that was generating all kinds of information, we needed to have a more concentrated way of approaching the legislature with it to implement the changes that our research was demonstrating needed to happen. And our research also included eyewitness identification research. So we were gathering the data. We needed to figure out how best to get that data in front of the people the change makers, who could help us make the changes that would prevent the things that we were uncovering from happening. And so that was when we got a grant in order to hire somebody to focus on policy work for a fixed term, to at least get us started doing it. And that was when we were able to hire Lucy Salcida Carter, who became our policy person, our director of policy, for a couple of years. Before that, we had a staff member of ours who was doing it as well as handling her caseload. And that was when we realized we needed to have a specific person take this on. And under her watch, under her tutelage, we learned a lot about how to pursue policy change. We got a real presence up in the Capitol. And we had some significant legislative successes, and that was phenomenal for us. So we learned a lot. And so then when her term ended, we were able to transition Melissa O'Connell, we know her as Missy, into the role as our policy liaison, who is working with the Coalition of California Innocence Projects in the Capitol to effectuate the changes that we've identified really need to happen to prevent wrongful convictions.
Awesome, which very nicely leads us to Melissa Missy O'Connell. So welcome, Missy. Thank you for joining us. Introduce yourself. I know I already did the introduction, but maybe what you can do is when you started at around 2016 in this position as policy liaison, there was the California Innocence Coalition has been mentioned a couple times. Linda mentioned it. So maybe launch into how that formed and talk about that. Let's start there.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I hope everyone's healthy and safe at home. I'm so happy to join you today. So it's actually really interesting because as Linda was saying, I'm one of the attorneys with NCIP. And so when I transitioned into policy work, it was a transition. There is a benefit to being a lawyer who gets to go up and lobby about changes in our law, because as lawyers, as practitioners, we're the ones who are feeling the impact of those laws, or navigating changes in our laws and litigating them. But then there is another side to policy work that requires that we're able to really communicate to other stakeholders what the problems are from a non-legal lawyer perspective, and why they should care about a particular issue. And so what's been really significant for our policy work in the last 6 years was that we did formally create the California Innocence Coalition. And as Lori and Linda mentioned, there are 2 other innocence projects in California Innocence Project in San Diego and Loyola Project for the Innocent out of Los Angeles. And myself and 2 amazing women from those projects, we are a united front up at the Capitol. And we formed this coalition because we realized not only that the 3 innocence projects needed to be on the same page as to what the issues were that we wanted to address and how we went about addressing them, but that we were such a stronger force up in the Capitol to be this united front of our 3 projects. And so that was really cool for us to be able to do that. We meet routinely. Quite comically, our names are Missy, Nikki, and Jazzy. So we're kind of this funny trio up at the Capitol. But we've also built a presence up there, which, Linda highlighted, which I don't think I can emphasize enough how critically important it is, not only for us to lobby for our own bills by being present up at the Capitol, but also to have our finger on the pulse as to other criminal justice reform that is going on in our state capitol that affects our work and our clients. And it's difficult to do that if you don't have a constant presence up there.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk about the importance also of California having a 2-year legislature? I think people might not know that, and just the difference and what an impact that makes for the work.
Yeah, we're incredibly lucky in California. We have a 2-year legislature that meets every year, and so we're in the 2nd year of our 2-year session, and then we start a new session in January. And so it's appropriate for a state the size of California, because given our size, I remain hopeful that we are constantly thinking about how we can change our criminal justice system and other laws in our state that affect our communities. Whereas smaller jurisdictions and smaller states aren't necessarily confronted with the different circumstances, certainly with the rapidness that we are in California. And so we get to constantly be thinking about what problems our cases are confronting, what problems our clients are confronting, and get ready and get geared up for the next legislative session. So we take a long view in our state legislature, and we take a short view, and we get to do that in California because the legislature is constantly meeting, which is really a benefit. And I didn't appreciate that until I was at a policy conference that's held annually with all the other innocence projects in the country. And then you hear of some states that have a state legislature that meets once every 3 years. And I just can't imagine the frustration that comes with wanting to affect change and being unable to do that because you just don't have time on your side.
So can you, in your time and at NCIP, can you give an example of a law that was changed that enabled NCIP to move forward with one of its cases and help to free an individual or exonerate them in definition?
Yeah, absolutely. And that case would be a man named Darwin Crabtree. And so this was when Lucy was still at the helm of our policy work. And every time I run into Lucy up at the Capitol, because she thankfully has continued policy work, even though it's with a different organization, she is constantly affecting change in our system. But there was one day when I went up to her and I was like, I am so sorry. I did not know how hard this work was and how much you had to fight to get these laws changed, because it's a lot of work and it's a lot of breaking it down for the community up at the Capitol to understand what the problems are, but also understanding how it is that we can fix things. And so Darwin's case is a prime example of that, in that Darwin was convicted of a sexual crime for which he was innocent. He received a determinate sentence. He had always maintained his innocence. He had reached out to our project, but by the time that happened, he was out of custody. He had served the entirety of his sentence, and then he was out while free of incarceration. He had to register as a sex offender for the rest of his life. And at that moment, given our habeas laws, we were unable to challenge Darwin's conviction because habeas law didn't allow you to challenge their conviction if they were no longer incarcerated. And so in 2017, it was just this amazing, beautiful thing that happened up at the Capitol, and that there were 2 pieces of legislation that single-handedly would secure eventually Darwin's true freedom from his wrongful incarceration. And the first was one that was sponsored by our project, and Lucy fought tooth and nail to get passed, and that was to add a habeas claim to our law that allowed somebody to bring newly discovered evidence and have their conviction reversed if it was more likely than not that a jury would have reached a different outcome. And you might hear a little bit more about that when you hear from Lionel in a few minutes as well. But that was a significant change in the law, because we were realizing that our innocent clients couldn't reach the previous standard for newly discovered evidence. And the legislature recognized that innocent men and women would die in prison if we didn't change that standard and give them a more fair shake. And at the same time as that, there was another bill going on that changed the standing rules for habeas. And it basically said, if you are actually innocent, it doesn't matter if you're incarcerated or not, you get to challenge your conviction. And so those 2 things combined resulted in Darwin's true freedom. I guess it's been 2 years ago now, which was just such a huge blessing. And I think the most incredible thing that extended from that, beyond Darwin being truly vindicated for a horrible accusation against him, was that Darwin then found how strong and how powerful his voice and his story could be up at the Capitol to he himself then affect change for others who might be in a similar circumstance.
Thank you. So just like our casework, policy reform takes time and takes persistence, right? Yes. So I'd love to tee up having this conversation with Lionel. So we're going to bring Lionel into it really quickly here. But can you tee it up, Missy, about this timing and persistence and about eyewitness identification? Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. So as Linda pointed out, the CCFAJ had studied all of these issues around wrongful conviction, and they identified eyewitness identification as one of the leading causes. And they didn't just identify it as a problem, but they actually identified solutions to reduce the risk of it being a problem. And they identified best practices that could be implemented by law enforcement to reduce the risks of future wrongful convictions as a result of mistaken eyewitness identification. And despite this coming about in 2008, and despite 6 efforts up at the Capitol to have California adopt best practices for all law enforcement agencies in the state, we couldn't get it done. And so we had several bills that either never made it out of the legislature or were vetoed by the governor at the time until 2 years ago. And with the help of Senator Wiener, who was the author for SB 923, which laid out these best practices to be mandated by all law enforcement agencies in the state. California then became the 24th state, 23rd, 24th state to actually require that law enforcement comply with best practices. And before I kick it over to Lionel, because he really is the best person to talk about the impact of these laws, I just want to highlight that California, being this huge state and being recognized by a lot of other states as being progressive in a lot of ways, when you do policy work, you realize that California is actually behind on a lot of things. And we have an incredible state legislature that really cares about these issues, but there are just some things that we're behind. I mean, the fact that we were behind 22, 23 other states on eyewitness identification reform, that was something that bothered a lot of people. And I think it really impacted it going through 2 years ago.
Thank you, Missy. Okay, so let's bring Lionel into the mix. Hey, Lionel, are you ready?
I guess so.
I know that you are on the road and you've been working all day, so we really, really appreciate you joining us today. And this is a great opportunity. We haven't seen you in a really long time, so it's really great to see you. You're looking good, you're looking busy, and you're always busy. But I would love to kick it off if you can introduce yourself. Tell us about, or tell the audience and the viewers a bit about your story, about your case, as much as you want to say. You know it like nobody else. So I'm just going to hand it off to you, and I'll cue you on certain things here as they come up, but I want you to take it.
Okay, sure. Yeah, well, my name is Lionel Rubalcava. I was wrongfully convicted and sentenced to life for a crime I didn't commit. I spent 17 years in prison, and I recently got exonerated. It was about a year ago. Yeah, I mean, I can't really speak for a lot of people, but like from my case, it was basically a misidentification. The way it was handled, I mean, I don't know if we can get into that, but I know that was a big issue on my case, and obviously I was familiar with some of the law enforcement people that were involved in my case. So yeah, I mean that's my story. I mean, you guys came into the picture. Well, was it about 2014 or 12?
So
now I reached out to you guys since like 05.
Mm-hmm. So
can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. So I'm jumping in. Sorry to interrupt. What can we step back just a little bit, and like, how old were you? When did this happen? What was it? What was the circumstance around? Why were you arrested? Why were you convicted? What happened? For people who don't.
I was 20. Yeah, I was 23 years old when I.
Uh-oh.
Oh, we lost.
There you go.
Come back.
There he is. We lost you.
Oh, there we go.
You're back.
Okay. Yeah, it got disconnected.
You just didn't want to tell us how old you are.
Okay, so there we go. Yeah, so I was actually 23 when I got arrested. And what happened was I was arrested for attempted murder. It was a drive-by shooting. I guess the circumstances behind it were, somebody was standing on the street on a Friday afternoon, and somebody came by in a vehicle and started shooting, and somebody got shot. And I guess because I had drove by the same neighborhood or the same street was a few days later, I talked to this girl that I didn't know, and she happened to be the victim's sister. And I guess since I think that the family was on edge because something serious had just happened there, and they were told by the police that if they had seen anything that was suspicious or whatever, to notify or whatever, to call. And they were a little bit afraid, and they called the police. And then I guess that's where things turned to, like, I guess things got pointed in my direction,
Mm-hmm. Okay, so yep, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead, go ahead.
Okay, so that brings us up to the point when you were talking about when NCIP got involved. So maybe NCIP, Linda, Missy, generally speaking, when we get involved in a case, what in particular in Lionel's case, what did you see was wrong? You know, as an attorney, I know his attorney was Paige Caneb on our team, but you know, from your perspective, what did you see wrong?
Well, so I know that Paige was always troubled by the case, particularly because Lionel had a pretty rock solid alibi for the time of the shooting. And from everything Paige did to investigate the case, it seemed as if it would have been impossible for Lionel to actually have been where he could prove that he was. And also be at the place of the shooting. So she was very troubled by that because she felt as if that alibi hadn't been fairly considered and that the prosecution had misrepresented it when they were talking in their closing argument about where Lionel was at the time. So I know that really caught her interest. I know she did a lot of investigation into the circumstances of the eyewitness identifications, which were weak, if you could even call them that. They were poor eyewitness identifications. And interestingly enough, what Paige did, which she often does, which all of us often do, is assume that the prosecution did not want to convict an innocent person. And so engage in a conversation with them and educate them as to what we're finding, what our investigation is showing, and help them see that given what we know about the case now, they wouldn't have pursued the case then. And that's essentially what she did. She convinced the prosecution in this case that they shouldn't have proceeded with the case then, and that fairness and justice required that they concede that this was a wrongful conviction, and they did. They conceded that it was a wrongful conviction, and they conceded that Lionel was factually innocent. It took too long. There's no way to say that those 17 years can ever be recaptured. There's 17 years that Lionel lost. But ultimately, the prosecution did do the right thing, as did the court, reversed and dropped charges and declared that he's innocent. Mm-hmm. Lionel's also really fortunate to have a really wonderful family that stuck with him through all of this. For him to come home to and engage with and be a part of. So it's a wonderful thing as well.
So Lionel, can you talk about, so you were freed on May 15th, 2019. So since then, so that's just over a year ago, what's your experience? What have you been doing? Obviously, you are very busy. You have a job that keeps you very busy. You have family. What has your experience been like in the last year?
I mean, obviously, considering the previous 17 years, I would say it's been pretty good. I mean, I've been reconnecting with my, with friends and family and bonding and stuff. Getting to like experience things. I mean, obviously with the coronavirus, it's kind of like, things have kind of gotten slowed down, but, just trying to learn the way of life out here, just trying to get reacquainted with, with society and stuff,
What are some of the most difficult things some of the challenges that you've faced? Because you're still a young guy, Lionel.
I'm still what?
You're still a young guy. What?
I don't know. I think other people might have a different opinion.
I think so. What are some of the challenges? Because obviously the last 17 years when you were incarcerated wrongfully, things were evolving and changing. There was a lot going on.
I mean, obviously getting involved in the workforce, the line of work that I'm trying to get into, like landscape construction, all that stuff has kind of changed, and there's new technology and there's new ways about, doing things. So, you kind of got to get up to speed on that. So I've been trying to like focus on, getting things you know, getting things done over here. That's work and stuff. You know, trying to build a career out of this stuff. I'm trying to learn, and you know, I guess that's a challenge. You know, I have I have a 24-year-old son. I didn't get to spend much time with him. You know, obviously he was really young when I think he was like 6 years old when I was arrested, and you know, he's 24 years old now. He's a grown man, and just to just to be able to try to rebond with him as a father son, you know, have that relationship. It's you know, it's kind of like it's a difficult because, you know, like I said, I couldn't really have that opportunity to be a father to him, you know. So that's a challenge too, you know, and I don't know, just little things like that. But everything else, I think that I'm kind of starting to adjust little by little, you know?
Yeah. Yep. Missy, I'm going to bring you in about some of the learning that happens when we have cases like Lionel's that leads to policy reform. Can you talk about what are some key findings, key learnings? What are things that sort of drive our policy reform efforts as we hear these stories and we learn about these cases?
Yeah, you know, a couple of years ago, we realized that we could kind of categorize our policy work in 3 different buckets, like 3 different vantage points on the, you know, the criminal justice spectrum. And one was policy efforts that were directed at preventing wrongful convictions from happening. And like in Lionel's case, the eyewitness identification reform, that was about preventing wrongful convictions from happening, you know, just adopting best practices, reducing the risks of a wrongful ID, because our system's full of humans, right? And so we're always going to have human error. And so to the extent that we can reduce those risks, we, you know, advocate for legislation that does that. So that's on this end of preventing wrongful convictions. And then there's work we do to intervene when a wrongful conviction does happen. And that would be the example of Darwin on the efforts to change the habeas claim, when we realized that we had so many innocent clients that just couldn't meet the previous newly discovered evidence standard. If, you know, we basically got to the point is if we can't convince the court, then we got to go in and change the law and then come back and do it again. And that's what we did. And so we intervened at that level so that we could bring more innocent people home. And then the last piece is, once our clients come home, what types of legislation can support their reentry home? And you know, that's not our area of expertise at our Innocence project. You know, our goals are to get our folks home, you know, get our clients home. But something that we struggle with is what it's like when they get home. You know, as Lionel's explaining, there's this transition. And what's important to recognize is that there is a difference between a person who's been wrongfully convicted for an extended period of time and someone who was convicted of a crime that they did commit and them serving their time. And our clients fight really hard to be recognized as different, and they ask that stakeholders treat them differently. And one of our exonerees, Obi Anthony, has been instrumental in that last piece of the continuum there, in that he and other exonerees have advocated for legislative change to help support exonerees as they transition home, which has been just significant to impacting our client's life. But to directly answer your question, you know, and Linda's been talking about it a fair bit, you know, our cases drive our policy reform. Like every case has an issue, and we try to get to the root cause of that issue and figure out how to prevent that from happening in future cases, or making it easier to identify in cases. And then there's data. And that was another thing Linda highlighted, you know, all that research that Cookie and Todd and Maurice did, and the CCFAJ, all of that research and all of that data, that's also what drives our policy reform efforts.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So we have a couple people viewing, watching. Some are our own family and community. We have Frankie we referenced his case. Frankie's watching. We have Martin Lewa is watching.
Wow.
Hey.
Yeah. He says right on and hi. Lionel, I want to ask about just sort of that extended community. You know, you did have, or you do have a very supportive family, friends, community. Can you talk about just the importance of that for you, and what else, you know, what other extended community is there out there that's providing support, and what is it that, you know, fulfilling some of those needs that you have post exoneration?
Oh yeah, I mean, I obviously I think it's really important to have you know, support groups and people that are willing to help and lend a hand. I mean, you know, coming out, you know, out of prison after 17 years is, if I mean, I could just imagine, had I not had support and family and friends, you know, to kind of see me through this. You know, you're at a position where, I mean, like I said, now these days, especially, you know, not being in the workforce for, like I said, you know, X amount of time. I mean, you can't just jump into this and be like, okay, you know, like I'm gonna just do this on my own. Like it's very difficult, you know, not being able to have support. So for me, it's, you know, it's kind of been like one of the biggest blessings, you know, just being able to have, you know, my parents and brothers and sisters and friends, and you know, everybody's kind of like, you know, from the moment that I walked out, you know, you know, they greeted me with, you know, with open arms, and I was pretty much like financially I was helped, and you know, was given, given a truck by my parents, and you know, like everybody kind of like contributed a little bit to me, you know, being able to like more easily just get through it, you know, and maintain out here, you know. A lot of people, I think that when they don't have that, I think that they resort to probably going back to crime or doing something else, you know, because they can't make it, you know, on their own, you know. So for me, it's like I said, the community. I mean, I haven't really been involved as far as, you know, but like I said, with as far as family and friends, you know, they're kind of like the core of my support, you know.
Yep. So Missy, I want to bring back again, you mentioned it before, but the importance of the stories and the clients' voices in our policy reform work. And this sort of leads into the next part of our conversation about what are policy issues that we're looking at currently. There are a lot of things that we're supporting now that deal with racial and social justice. There's things going to be in the future. What are current trends? What are our priorities? How do we set those priorities within the context of the California Innocence Coalition? But also just the importance, again, of those voices. And you did bring up Darwin going to the Capitol. It's Darwin was there, you know, Frankie's there, Obi's there, Zav's there. You know, there's so many voices that are so important. And if you can talk about that a bit.
Yeah, sure. I'm gonna unfold that a little bit because I think there was a lot in there. But starting with the easiest piece of it is, yeah, I mean, and I would add Maurice Caldwell into that list of names too, of individuals who, I mean, the best way that I could capture it is exactly like what Lionel's doing right now, right? Like our clients suffer one of the gravest injustices that anyone could imagine in our criminal justice system. And they come out on the other side of it, and they go out and they retell their stories, their tragedies over and over again, sometimes to audiences who do not empathize, who do not sympathize, and they continue to do it to try to make their reality not become someone else's. And what's incredible about our legislature, again, is they get that. Like our clients walk into a committee hearing, sit down at that table, and people stop talking. I'll sit there and half the room leaves, but when our clients speak, people listen and they see their faces and they hear their stories. And as a legislature, they realize that they have the power to affect change to prevent this from happening to others. And they do that. And so our clients really are truly the strongest voices up at the Capitol. And those of us that assist them with the policy work, we're just blessed to be able to share a table with them and kind of tee up their stories.
Yeah. So they're doing things like they're meeting one-on-one with legislators and staffers. They're testifying in committees. They're, there's a lot that they're doing, right?
Huge amount that they're doing. And they're sitting with staffers. They're sitting with the people who are writing these bills and just telling their story and saying, hey, here's the face to it. And this is why this matters. It's really incredible because if you think about a lot of significant laws in our country and in our state, they were driven by a single case. When you think of the 3 strikes law in California, when you think of Marcy's law, Megan's law, right? One huge tragedy that just rocks an entire community, it leads to change. And that is what we recognize about our work, is it should take one case, like to look at one face like Lionel's and go, what happened there? And how do we make sure we don't do it again? And how do we protect other people from being in the same situation? And that's when you realize how strong their voices are. You asked another question about like right now. So sadly, because of COVID, our legislature took a huge hit to that. And they had to prioritize bills that addressed COVID needs. But then at the same time that we were dealing with that pandemic, we got thrown into another one, and one that's been around for decades, but really came to the forefront in the last several months, and that was racial injustice. And to our legislature's huge credit, they prioritize bills that directly address racial injustice in our state. And while we had 2 bills that were going on when COVID hit, they did sadly die at the Capitol. But that made us kind of shift our lens a little bit and try to figure out how our clients' voices could be heard when it came to racial injustice. Because if you look in all of our cases, you will see racial injustice is threaded through all of them, or official misconduct. And so we realized our voices were needed more than ever now to support others' efforts to improve our system so that people aren't discriminated and face injustices based on race.
Mm-hmm. And we will dive deeper into that conversation at our second in this series when we talk about present. So that's our current legislative efforts and policy reform efforts. So that's a great tee up for the next one, which is on the 20th. So pay attention to social media and all of that. We'll announce that soon. Can you talk briefly about compensation in the state of California? We get that question all the time when we're presenting. What is compensation? What does that mean for our clients and the wrongfully convicted and incarcerated?
Did you say briefly? You said briefly talk about compensation.
I did, because we can have a whole nother episode on compensation.
Yeah, yes, we can.
That would be very interesting, and maybe we should. I'll take a note.
Well, I will start with the positive news about it, is that we actually can talk about compensation in California, because California is one of I think we're at 36 states now that do have a compensation statute to be able to try to provide some monetary compensation for individuals who were wrongfully convicted. And we can't say that about the other 14 states that don't. And there's been several states in the last 5 years even who just created a compensation statute, and California has existed for at least 60 years. Like we've long had it. The issue is, and just to back up one, our compensation statute is that if an individual has been found to be factually innocent and wrongfully incarcerated for a felony, they can seek compensation from the state of California. And in our statute, it's $140 a day for every day of wrongful conviction, which amounts to about $51,000 a year, which is something, and our clients come out with nothing. And so it could be significant to our clients' lives. The sad reality, however, is that the way our compensation process is structured right now, when our clients' convictions get reversed, their cases are reversed for numerous legal reasons that highlight their wrongful conviction. But they then have to establish that they are factually innocent. So they have to establish with affirmative evidence that they are factually innocent, which really requires them litigating their case all over again after they have fought for years to secure their freedom. They now, and us or other lawyers, have to fight to establish that they are factually innocent. And that can take, on average, 2.5 to 5 years beyond the years that they were fighting for their freedom to justify why they're deserving of compensation. And sadly, about 30% of our clients never see compensation at all. Lionel was very fortunate in his case, and all of it is to applaud Paige Caneb, who fought like hell to secure Lionel's freedom, but then also was successful in obtaining a finding of factual innocence for Lionel, which means that his compensation was then automatic. And so Lionel will be compensated by our state for his 17 years of wrongful incarceration. And as Linda highlighted, and I don't think anyone can emphasize this enough, no amount of money can fully restore what our clients have lost. But it at least gives them a fair shake at trying to transition back home.
Mm-hmm. And this brings up just another thing that I don't want to miss too, and Linda mentioned it early on, is the relationships with the district attorneys. Because in Lionel's case particularly, it was so important. Linda, do you want to respond to that? That tees us up nicely also for the third in our series, which is all about voting. So we'll talk about that there.
Yeah, like I mentioned, we always assumed that prosecutors don't want to wrongfully convict somebody, that they are proceeding with the assumption that they have the right person. I know that there are some that that's not the case, that they're bad or that they're evil, but for the most part, I'm going to assume that they want to do the right thing and that they're trying to convict somebody who they think actually did whatever it is. And so we start there and have worked really hard to develop relationships with many of the district attorney's offices in our area that we practice. And I think it has allowed us to educate them a little bit about what we're finding and what we see. It gives us the opportunity to go to them before we go to court, before we make it a fight, before we have to go litigate something. We can go to them and see if there's some way we can work this out, convince them of the mistake that was made, and get their cooperation. And even if we're not successful, just doing it helps, because we are not hiding the ball ever. We put our cards on the table and show them what it is we've found and what we've learned and why we believe our client is innocent. And I believe that that helps us even as we're litigating the case, if they do still feel the need to litigate the case. they see that we came to them with exactly what we said we had, and that's what we had. And then when a court finds it sufficient, it vindicates really what we came to them with. Miss had the perfect case for that. She went to them with some, what we believe to be exonerating DNA results, and the district attorney, we went to them before, we went to them after we litigated it, we kept involving them in the conversation, and ultimately they went and did, once our client's case was reversed, they went and did genetic genealogy and found an actual perpetrator, not our client. So, you know, we told them all along that this DNA evidence showed that it wasn't our client. And many district attorneys, since we've started, since 2001, have formed what are called conviction integrity units or conviction review units that are designated units within the office to look at cases of wrongful conviction, cases that we might come to them with, that other lawyers might go to them with, that somebody who's been convicted might approach them with themselves, or that they might even internally identify as a case that needs to be reconsidered. And that has been an evolution. There did not used to be a place you could go in a DA's office to bring to their attention a wrongful conviction. You sort of had to knock on the door and keep asking to get the right person.
Thank you for that. Lionel, one final thought. So I know that the finding of factual innocence, the hearing, that was like, you know, lasted what, 2 seconds? It was so fast.
It was pretty quick, yes, it was.
But it was a very powerful, a very powerful day.
Yes.
And how did, like, what did you feel that day? Like, what did you feel?
I mean, it's kind of a proud moment, right? Because for so long, you know, you've been considered a criminal, you know, a person that, you know, is guilty of a horrific crime or whatever. And, you know, for you to walk into the justice system, for them to tell you, hey, you know what, you know, we agree that you're innocent, you know, like we can admit that. Like I said, to me, it was a proud moment, and it was a pretty, like, I was relieved, you know, to hear that and to know that, you know, finally I can be cleared of all this, you know, nonsense and, you know, all these allegations that were made against me, you know. So it kind of just like makes you feel good about yourself, you know?
Yeah.
Kind of showing everybody that, hey, you know what? I was innocent. And maybe a lot of people didn't believe in me, but, you know, I'm here today and I can prove it, you know?
Awesome. Thank you so much. So we're at time. I want to let folks know that we have a commutation applications in for 4 clients, that we have a toolkit available on our website. It's at www.ncip.org/commutation. The toolkit is available with social media posts, scripts for writing directly to the governor's office. We're also going to be hosting a day of action on our policy reform efforts. So stay tuned on social media for that. We'll have a toolkit available for that as well. We are really into taking direct action, and so we're trying to provide as many resources as possible for people to do it as easily as possible. So just stay tuned on all of that. If anybody has any other questions or comments, reach out to us directly. You can reach out through Facebook as you're here. But I appreciate everybody's time. Thank you so much for joining us. Lionel, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lionel.
All right. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.